I'm Nima Rajan. Core public service, air travel, rail employees, and travelers must all be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 by the end of October. This, according to Canada's new mandatory vaccine policy. The federal government says public servants must prove that they are fully vaccinated against COVID-19 by October 29th or be put on unpaid administrative leave. Anyone wishing to hop aboard a plane or train must have received a second dose of a Health Canada-approved vaccine at least 14 days before their travels. For travelers, there will be a transition period until November 30th to show a negative test result. The NDP has written to the Federal Elections Commissioner, asking Yves Côté to investigate a list of alleged failures in last month's election. The party claims some polling stations opened late or didn't open at all, denying people their right to vote. It says many of those disenfranchised voters were Indigenous. The NDP wants an inquiry and action taken to ensure the alleged failures don't happen again. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says he and his entire caucus are disappointed with the outcome of last month's federal election. Conservatives finished the campaign with 119 seats in Parliament. They won 121 seats under Andrew Scheer in 2019. The party has asked outgoing Edmonton Centre MP James Cumming to hold a 360-degree review of the Tory campaign. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet says parliamentarians should return to Ottawa to work in person from now on. This instead of a hybrid formula. Before the election, MPs adopted a system of in-person and virtual attendance. Mr. Blanchet says he does not support that approach for the next sitting now that COVID-19 vaccinations are mounting. No charges will be laid in connection with Monday's discovery of potentially explosive devices near the U.S.-Canada border. It led to an 8-hour shutdown of the Ambassador Bridge. Police in Windsor, Ontario, say officers with the Canada Border Services Agency found 2 grenades submerged in an unknown white powder on Monday morning. They say further investigation showed the grenades were inert, no direct threats had been made, and the driver had no intent to use the grenades for a nefarious purpose. The BC government is expanding mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations to include its 30,000 public service employees. The BC Public Service Agency says government employees in core government or ministries will be required to provide proof of full immunization by November 22nd. This includes social workers, sheriffs, and administrative assistants. Edmonton's Public School Board has called on the province to implement a COVID-19 fire-break lockdown and close all schools. Premier Jason Kenney says COVID-19 remains a serious threat in the province and cases are growing in children between 5 and 11 years old. But instead of a shutdown, Mr. Kenney opted to reinstate contact tracing and public reporting of cases in schools. He also says school divisions will be encouraged to adopt mandatory vaccination policies for staff. Manitoba is shifting its COVID-19 third dose priorities to include healthcare workers who have direct contact with patients. The provincial government also says anyone who has received only the viral vector vaccines can now get a third dose with an mRNA vaccine. The changes were outlined in a memo to medical professionals from the province's top doctor. It says the third dose should be given at least 6 months after the second. The Quebec hospital where Joyce Echaquan, an Indigenous mother of 7, died, is set to be the subject of a lawsuit. A lawyer representing Ms. Echaquan's family made the announcement after Quebec's coroner issued a report on her death. It said she was the victim of systemic racism and inadequate health care. Ms. Echaquan broadcasted herself on Facebook Live as Facebook staff, or rather hospital staff, were heard making derogatory comments toward her shortly before her death on September 28, 2020. New Brunswick's government is imposing some tough health protection measures aimed at stopping a surge in COVID-19 cases. Premier Blaine Higgs says family gatherings during the Thanksgiving long weekend must be limited to single households. A new set of circuit breaker measures concerning gathering limits and travel restrictions will be imposed on 3 areas. These regions have the highest hospitalizations and death rates. The areas affected include the Upper St. John River Valley and Edmundston and the Moncton area. The Toronto Zoo and Toronto Symphony Orchestra have joined forces to produce a concert inspired by the sounds of animals. The performance, dubbed Zoophony, will be filmed at the zoo and a recording will be released to schools in November. The CEO of the Toronto Zoo says the partnership came about after the 2 organizations brainstormed ways in which they could serve the community during the pandemic. All right, we'll be right back after a short break and take a look at Canadian businesses and globalization in a post-COVID-19 pandemic world. We'll have an interview with Brendan Caldwell of Caldwell Securities up next. And of course, more news from around the world shortly after that. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Coming off the heels of a pandemic-fueled election, some Canadian businesses are hoping for success after nearly 2 years of declines. But the pandemic has not only affected businesses within Canada, it has impacted businesses around the world and the globalization of companies. So what does the future of Canadian business look like following the events of the pandemic? With us to talk about Canadian business and the future of globalization is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, always great having you on Forum Daily. Welcome back.
Thank you, Nima. Glad to be here.
So let's start with a quick overview of what exactly globalization is.
Depends who you ask. To some, it is the exporting of the dark satanic mills that William Blake wrote about. It's about how we export all of our manufacturing and human rights abuses to other countries, and then we just enjoy the fruits of their unholy labors. To others, and this is what I think we've seen in the last half century, it has been a way that countries all over the world that had been poverty-stricken have enabled themselves through a greater manufacturing base to haul themselves out of poverty and allow for both the absolute efficient and relative efficiency in economies where goods are manufactured where it is most efficient to do so, and a increasingly interlinked communication system has allowed those goods to travel all over the world, everything from auto parts to computer chips. So depends who you ask, but it's trade around the world, if you had to put it in just a few words.
All right, Brendan. Well, prior to this pandemic, we had been living in a world where products and manufacturing has been shipped throughout the world, almost as if there were no borders stopping them. Now with COVID-19 in play, what has happened to globalization?
Well, there was a move afoot, as I alluded to in my last question, against this globalization. Some of it has been human rights led, some of it has been union led, some of it has been just business led, because to the extent that goods are manufactured in other countries, they still have to get here. And while there is open and free communication and transport, that's been a good thing. But with COVID, because of different countries being locked down and communication systems not being what they had been, and frankly, just the level of trust between countries has regrettably also plummeted. We have seen a greater difficulty getting everything from Lime Diet Coke to the chips that power our cell phones transported from other countries.
So would you say the pandemic has maybe reversed globalization?
It has. That is the short answer. Whether that reverse is permanent or temporary remains to be seen, but it has certainly caused companies to rethink their supply lines, their supply chain, and where they get their goods from and how.
And taking a deeper look at supply chains themselves, they've been disrupted during the pandemic. We're seeing products either slowly not being replaced on shelves or becoming very expensive. So what does all of this mean for consumers, Brendan?
Well, you've seen it. The prices have gone up. From the early days of the pandemic, you didn't see prices rise so much as you saw assets rise. The amount of money pumped into the system caused asset inflation, everything from French wines to stocks to real estate. We've talked about that. Now we're seeing inflation in goods and services because it is harder to get things from elsewhere. Basic materials like copper has made it difficult to create everything from pressure hoses to copper wire that goes into electronics. So we are seeing inflation actually hit consumers where it matters now.
And all of this is impacting international trade. We're seeing more corporations deciding to manufacture within their own country, as you mentioned. So how would all of this change employment, or would a lot of this work be outsourced to robots?
Well, I think it'll be interesting. Yes, I think some of manufacturing now, when more manufacturing is done in North America, and more manufacturing will be done in North America because we cannot clearly rely on supply lines from overseas. I think more of it will be automated. It means that it will require a different, higher tech workforce than what perhaps was in place before. So it will mean more jobs, but it might not mean more jobs for the same people that hold the old jobs. So there will be continued disruption in the labor force. I think the good news for companies is that their supply may be more reliable, and for countries that they are less dependent overseas. That's the good news. I think the bad news potentially is when we were globalized and we relied on each other for goods, there was a greater degree of trust. There was a greater degree of necessity for us to have to get along. Now, when we become more self-reliant, we ask ourselves, well, why do we need you? And there is less cooperation on other things that matter globally. And that would be my biggest concern about the future post-COVID.
Some very interesting points there, Brendan. Always great having you on the show. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Nima.
Stay tuned. We'll have an interview with Mr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, up next. On Monday, China sent 56 fighter planes toward Taiwan in the largest show of force on record. This continues days of sustained military harassment against the self-ruled island. The U.S. president sent his national security advisor for talks with a senior Chinese foreign policy advisor. Meanwhile, a group of French senators has arrived in Taiwan for a 5-day visit led by a former defense minister. On Wednesday, Taiwan's defense minister said the situation has become the worst it has been in 40 years. This as the country's legislature debates approving a special defense budget. China claims democratically ruled Taiwan as its own territory to be brought under its control by force if necessary. The two split apart amid civil war in 1949. Well, with us to discuss this matter today is Dr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's good to speak with you, Nima.
Now, let's start with a quick overview of what has been happening between China and Taiwan in recent days.
Well, as you said in your introduction, the Chinese have been particularly aggressive towards Taiwan in sending in large fighter planes, designed to menace and intimidate the people of Taiwan. And I think to give some assurance to people in the People's Republic of China that the government in Beijing is still committed to restoring Taiwan to the embrace of the motherland, as they put it. From the People's Republic of China point of view, Taiwan is a renegade province run by an illegitimate regime, whereas the government of Taiwan was brought to power by a free and fair election, democratic election last year, and enjoys the overwhelming support of the people of Taiwan, nearly all of whom, according to polls, do not identify as Chinese and do not want their island to be controlled by an autocratic one-party regime in Beijing. They prefer freedom and democracy, which is the way that things are being run in Taiwan by the current Democratic People's Party government. So, it's a very troubling situation if China decides that they will take Taiwan by force.
And this increased military pressure started on Friday, which was China's National Day. So what kind of message is Beijing trying to send to Taiwan through this?
Well, there are problems in the Chinese economy at present. There's been a looming failure of an enormous $308 billion primarily construction firm, Evergrande, and other issues in the Chinese economy due to increasing Chinese government intervention in economic activity to promote social goals, Chinese communist social goals. So I think that by engaging in very aggressive action against Taiwan, it does distract the concern of the Chinese people over the prospect of a failing economy and put them more into an aggressive nationalist mode, expecting the potential for war with Taiwan, which of course would become the dominant issue in China, not what's wrong with the economy. So, this sort of thing goes on and not infrequently in China, where there are problems internally and they attempt to rally public support by engaging in strong action against Taiwan. But this is really unprecedented in its ferocity. And I think that's why so much of the global community is very concerned about where this may lead.
All right, sir, just about a minute and a half here. But speaking about the global community, considering that Taiwan split from China in 1949, why have most countries not established diplomatic ties with Taiwan yet?
Well, most of the countries had diplomatic ties with the regime on Taiwan, which was the former nationalist regime at the time that was ruling all of China, and then lost the Civil War in 1949. And so, for example, Canada recognized the Republic of China and then was obliged to withdraw recognition when we established relations with the People's Republic of China in 1970. But now I think a lot of countries are looking at Taiwan as a de facto independent democracy and thinking that perhaps we should establish and recognize that regime as a legitimate regime representing the aspirations of the people living there on the basis of the self-determination of peoples. And that, unfortunately, hastens the People's Republic of China, Chinese Communist regime, to settle this matter through military force if they can.
All right, Dr. Burton, definitely we'll have to keep an eye on this dispute here, but thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily and giving us your insight.
Good to speak with you.
After the break, we'll be back with stories from around the world, including the U.S. president saying Democrats are considering changes to Senate filibuster rules. That story and more coming up next. Stay tuned. An investigation is continuing into what caused an offshore pipeline break. It spilled 500,000 liters of crude oil into the ocean off Huntington Beach in Southern California. U.S. federal transportation investigators say one possibility is that an anchor on a cargo ship snagged the pipe, dragged it 30 meters along the ocean floor, and eventually cracked it open. The Coast Guard has acknowledged it did not investigate the spill for nearly 10 hours after the first call came in on Friday. U.S. President Joe Biden says Democrats are considering a change to the Senate's filibuster rules. This in order to quickly approve lifting the nation's debt limit. Mr. Biden told reporters late Tuesday at the White House that it's a real possibility. The president's off-the-cuff remarks interject a new urgency in an increasingly uncertain situation. Days before an October 18th deadline to act, the Senate is tangled in a dangerous partisan standoff. Republicans are putting up hurdles to the vote. European Union leaders are gathering to reassure 6 countries in the Balkans that they could join the trading bloc one day. That is, if they can meet the EU standards. But an EU summit in Slovenia on Wednesday is unlikely to provide any signals to Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia of when they might advance in their quests. But all 27 EU countries must agree unanimously to move forward, and Bulgaria is blocking the process due to a dispute with North Macedonia. The prospect of EU membership has been a powerful driver of political and economic reform in the volatile Balkans. German police have carried out large-scale raids in 25 cities. This is in connection with a suspected money laundering network. The network is alleged to have funneled more than 162 million in ill-gotten gains abroad. Some of the money made its way to Islamic militant groups. Dusseldorf police say Wednesday's raids involved more than 1,000 officers, and it took place in 3 states in the west and north of the country. 11 people were arrested. Newly leaked documents show that for years, Lebanon's politicians and bankers have stowed wealth in offshore tax havens and used it to buy expensive properties. Many newly impoverished Lebanese citizens have been caught in one of the world's worst economic meltdowns in decades. Some of the names revealed in the Pandora Papers belong to the ruling elite that is being blamed for the economic collapse. Many in Lebanon have lost access to savings and now struggle to get water, electricity, and medicine. Candidates in Iraq's parliamentary election on Sunday are trying to persuade the country's younger voters to trust a balloting process, which has long been tainted by tampering and fraud. Public apathy is widespread, and some of the pro-reform activists whose street protests in 2019 led to the vote are calling for a boycott at the polls. Iraq's youth made up a large part of the protests, and they make up the country's largest demographic in the election. Work is halted at all of the Kellogg Company's U.S. cereal plants as roughly 1,400 workers went on strike. It wasn't immediately clear just how much the supply of Frosted Flakes and other iconic brands would be disrupted. The union and company have been at an impasse for more than a year. Daniel Osborne, the president of the local union in Omaha, said the dispute is over the loss of several key benefits, and the company has threatened to move work to Mexico. The company insists that its offer is fair and would increase wages. An Australian government minister says a review of defamation laws will likely examine whether platforms such as Facebook should be held liable for users' posts. The High Court made a landmark ruling last month. It said that media outlets are publishers of allegedly defamatory comments posted by third parties on their official Facebook pages. Communications Minister Paul Fletcher said the ruling did not touch on whether Facebook could also be held liable. But a review of defamation laws across Australia is likely to consider it. Well, meanwhile, a former Facebook data scientist testified before Congress that the social network's products harm children and fuel polarization in the U.S. Speaking before the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, Frances Haugen accused her former company of knowing the apparent harm Instagram can cause on some teens. This and being dishonest in its public fight against hate and misinformation. While efforts to pass new regulations on social media have failed in the past, senators said on Tuesday that the time for inaction has passed. Canadian-born actor Michael J. Fox will be receiving an award from the American Association of Retired Persons. This is for his work with his charity that advocates for Parkinson's research. The actor will be receiving the AARP's Honorary Purpose Prize Award on December 15th. The Emmy Award-winning actor was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1991. His Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research has funded more than $1 billion in global research programs. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. I'm Nima Rajan, and this was Forum Daily News. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.